group to discuss your data analysis. I'll give you some strategies. We'll talk about coding, what to do with maybe Likert scale items that some of you are using in your questionnaires. We'll also look at, in some cases, you will need to be converting qualitative information to quantitative information, especially when you're looking at things like frequencies and duration. But today what I wanted to do is to provide an example, kind of a demonstration of how you can use generative AI to help you with your data analysis. Again, in the whole group session, we'll talk about what coding is, but in this video, I'll give you some things to think about. I'll give you a prompt that you might consider maybe adapting to perhaps to facilitate the way that you analyze some of your qualitative information. So in this demonstration here, I have a prompt, and before you try this on your own, do make sure that you go through and read this information that I am sharing in this space. If you collapse this demonstration, you will get some information, very important information about things to consider, ethical things you need to take into consideration. For example, not sharing any personal information of your participants. We don't want to use anyone's real name, any names of schools. We want to protect the confidentiality of our participants, and this also applies whenever you're inputting or creating prompts and using generative AI for these analysis. So in this case, you can choose to use pseudonyms. That would be my recommendation, but you would want to use either fake names, pseudonyms, or maybe number some of your participants. Okay, so in this case, for this demonstration, what I did was I took all of the reflections from week 10, all of your weekly reflections, just as an example, and I used the following prompt to analyze the reflections from week 10. It reads as follows. Act as a qualitative research assistant. I will provide student reflections that relate to their weekly progress for conducting their research project. Please read them carefully and identify and organize into 3 levels of coding by grouping initial codes into categories, and then a separate list that groups categories into themes. And again, we'll talk about this in more detail in our whole group session, but this is the prompt that I used. And then I copied and pasted all of the reflections that were completed for week 10. Now the output, this is the output, everything below this heading. And I didn't make any changes, just to show you the results that were part of the output here. So the initial codes, as we'll talk about, are going to be very specific. You're going to follow what's called an inductive approach. So whenever you begin the coding process, coding is simply labeling text, labeling the data that you've collected. So everything that I share here will come after you have analyzed, you have basically converted all of your data into text. And I'm thinking specifically about recorded interviews or class observations. All of those audios and videos will need to be converted to text. They'll need to be transcribed. So essentially, you're going to follow this process throughout all of the different sources of information that you have collected. And you're going to simply label different parts of the text that you come up with. Some of those labels might be generated on your own. You might create your own codes. Maybe some of the codes are stemming directly from the literature review. You could also include what's called in vivo coding, which means you're creating a label, a code from the actual text. So whatever, let's say that a teacher uses a particular term or a phrase, that could be in and of itself a label that you include in this first level 1 coding, this initial codes that you're going to be coming up with. The key to good initial coding is making sure that you are being specific enough. You don't want to start too general, because this process starts specific and builds to the more general. So if you start too general, you really have no place to go. So these initial codes, this is a list of the initial codes, again, based on generative AI. And what I will need to do is go through and be selective and find which of these initial codes are accurate, are useful, and go through and either remove any codes that aren't relevant or modify them as I need to. But this gives you an idea of some of the very specific codes that stemmed from week 10, the week 10 reflections. So some of the reflections talked about finishing their interviews, and this is what they plan to do. They plan to start writing the method section. They got the syllabus. This is just codes, just items or labels that were generated based on the reflections that were included for week 10. So this is the level 1 or initial coding. Now, if I scroll down here, then the next step, once I've completed this process, and imagine again, I'm going to be looking and considering all of the data that I have included. So depending on how much data that you input, right, there may be some limitations depending on the LLM that you're using, the service, if you're using ChatGPT, or if you're using Copilot, or if you're using Gemini Advanced or any other LLM, there could be some limitations. Okay, so we'll talk about some ways to get around that in the whole group session. But again, this is just for demonstration purposes. But imagine that I have considered all of the data that I've collected when generating this list. Another way to think about this is I'm not going to be ready for the second level of coding until I have analyzed all of the data that I have collected. Now, one thing to keep in mind is when you are looking at all the data, you're likely to have data that's not relevant to your research questions. So you're not going to label that text. You're only labeling things that relate to your study, that relate to your literature review, that relate to your research questions. So also keep that in mind. You need to review all of the data, but you don't necessarily, in fact, you won't be labeling or coding every bit of the text that you collect. Okay, so let's imagine we've gone through all my data sources. I've determined what is useful and what is not useful, and I have assigned labels to text. And again, when I assign labels, I could assign labels to an individual word, a phrase, a sentence, a paragraph, maybe even perhaps a section. So it could be different depending on the label. Okay, so also keep that in mind. The amount of text that you are identifying or labeling will vary. It'll vary between a word up to, let's say, a paragraph, maybe a section. Okay, so let's go to the second level of coding. So now the second level simply means that I'm going to be taking all of the initial codes listed above here, and I'm going to categorize or group them now into categories. And the categories, the name of the categories are going to be, I'm going to generate those based on the initial codes that I'm grouping. So this is what I've done here. These are the initial codes. I mean, I didn't do this. Generative AI generated this. But you can see here that it's grouped the initial codes into categories. Again, it's just another label. And it should represent those more specific codes that were captured or generated from the level 1 codes. So here are my categories. And a level 3 coding will then take those categories and generalize those into themes. And that's what they've done here. These are the categories. And now we're generating even a more, a more broad label or name or code. And basically these are my themes. So again, this is just to give you kind of a general overview of what coding might look like. You might find GenAI here helpful in this regard. We'll talk more about this in our group session, but again, this video is meant to give you a brief demonstration on what this looks like, what it might look like. And, when you finish this whole process, we'll talk more about this in May when we come back on May 5th. You will want to generate what's called a code book that will be an appendix in your thesis paper, where in your data analysis, you will reference that code book. Okay, so in the data analysis section of your methods section, you will describe the way in which you analyze the information, and part of that will be coding, since all of you are doing some form of a qualitative research project, that the coding aspect is going to be something that you discuss, and you're essentially going to be discussing how you analyze the information in terms of what kinds of codes did you use. As I mentioned earlier, did you come up with your own codes? Did you use codes that came specifically from the literature or from your literature review? And or did you use codes that were in Bibo codes? They were actually assigned based on kind of examples of the information that you collected from your participants. And talk more in our whole group session of other ways that you'll be analyzing your data, that you'll be explaining in this third subsection called data analysis in your methods section. All right, so we'll stop there, and we'll see everybody in our next whole group session. Again, April 16th, 2025 at 10 o'clock in the morning. We'll be in room 7, module 3 in the language department. Okay, so we'll stop there, and we'll see everybody in our next session.